Hello and welcome to Omnia, the podcast on all things Penn Arts and Sciences. This season, we're taking a close look at the state of U.S. democracy in the context of the 2024 election. I'm your host, Stephanie Perry, exhausted exit pollster, executive director of the Penn Program on Opinion Research and Election Studies, and a member of the NBC News Decision Desk team. In today's episode, I'll talk with John Lapinski, Director of Elections at NBC News, about the results of the 2024 election and get some insights into our experience calling the race at the Decision Desk. We'll also discuss how the polls measured up to the election night results and what our exit polling revealed about voters' motivations in this year's election. In addition to his role at NBC News, John is the Robert A. Fox Leadership Professor of Political Science and Faculty Director of the Robert A. Fox Leadership Program and the Director of the Penn Program on Opinion Research and Election Studies. He also serves as the Faculty Director for the Fels Institute of Government. Welcome to Democracy and Decision 2024, Episode 5, Post-Election Analysis. So, John, the results are in and we have a clear winner. Donald Trump has won the presidency again and will become the 47th president of the United States. Republicans have regained control of the Senate, and as of now, it looks like they'll potentially keep control of the House as well. From our vantage point of the race at the Decision Desk, can you talk about what it looked like early on? When did you know that Donald Trump and the Republicans might have a big night?
Yes. So we actually knew pretty early on. I mean, going into the night, no one really knew where this race was. I mean, it was either a lot of people thought it was a tied race or maybe it was going to either tilt Trump or tilt Harris. And so, again, before election night, no one knew. But we knew very quickly, actually, where this race was going. And part of the reason why we knew so quickly was because we have such a good team. And the team includes, a lot of Penn professors, Penn staff, and more importantly, a lot of students that we've trained in our programs like Poised and Fox. And so I would say by 9 o'clock at night, I mean, before that, we knew it was moving in Trump's direction. But by 9 o'clock at night, we had a pretty clear sense that he was going to win the presidency, that the Republicans were going to also probably take control of the Senate, and that the House was tilting Republican. And so even though it took us a lot longer to actually put in check marks, because we can't put in check marks until we're absolutely certain, we sort of knew where the night was going early on.
So going back to that 9-10 o'clock hour, can you talk a little bit about what exactly you were seeing that made you sure that the Republicans would have a good night?
So what we were seeing, we were collecting a lot of very granular data. So we had, again, the PORS team helping us collect precinct data in key places like Ohio. We were also collecting that in Florida. We were collecting that in Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. And so these are states that are obviously very critical. And so what we started to see at a granular level was that Harris was underperforming in key places. So she was underperforming in sort of urban areas. And more importantly, she was underperforming in the suburbs. And so I think everybody going into the night realized that Harris had to win the suburbs, and she was underperforming what Biden did in 2020. And so we saw it in so many places, and it seemed systematic. She was also underperforming in areas that had high numbers of Latinos. And so when we think through like what she needed, what did she need? She needed to do well in the suburbs. She needed to do extremely well with suburban women. And she also needed to, that she needed to do pretty well with Latinos. Everybody thought that the Democrats were doing a little less well with Latinos, but what we were seeing was not a little less well, it was a lot less well.
And the exit poll showed that, too. Trump obviously made huge gains among Latinos and specifically Latino men, and we saw that early on as well. So let's talk about a little bit of the pre-election polling. You mentioned this at the top, but all of the polls were basically within the margin of error for a close race. Can you talk about what the polls got right and maybe what they weren't able to capture this year that could have helped indicate Trump's success?
Yes. And so one of the things that we noticed, I actually wrote an article with a colleague of mine, Josh Clinton. And what we showed in that article is actually an article that did extremely well on NBC News. And we showed that pollsters were seemingly putting a heavy hand on how they were sort of weighting their data. And so, basically with polls, you have the data itself, and then you have decisions that pollsters make and how to weight the data, and that sort of determines the results. And a lot of the pollsters thought it was going to be a close race, so they were putting a heavy hand on these polls and pushing them to a tie. And so I think that that was not really what we were seeing in the data, but that was what pollsters were thinking. And so I think what the pollsters got wrong is they showed it artificially close. We sort of thought, and in our article we showed that it from a statistical perspective, it's most likely that the race was going to break one way or the other. And it did, and it broke in Trump's direction. Now that said, polling, while there were some misses, and there were particularly some misses in specific polls, it got some things right. And for example, most polls, especially polls that had over samples of Latinos, showed that the Democrats were doing poorer with Latinos, and that proved out to be true. They got it right directionally. The magnitude, I don't think they necessarily got right, but again, directionally, they showed that. The one thing that people sort of don't understand about polls, I think it's kind of commonly misunderstood, is polls can give us sort of spreads and margins on how groups will vote, but they don't tell us, it's a much trickier thing to actually figure out who's going to vote. And so polls really can't tell us anything about turnout. And that's another thing that we saw. It wasn't just the margins that we saw. What made Trump win, it was differential turnout. So basically Trump performed well in the areas that were pro-Trump. The turnout was higher. So it's not just the margin, it's the margin plus more people voting. And when you combine those together, it led to Trump doing exceedingly well.
So can you talk a little bit more about turnout? So far, it looks like neither Harris or Trump reached the levels we saw in 2020 during COVID. So can you talk through maybe where that vote came from this year and how you think that could have affected the result?
Yeah, I think that a lot of people going in, initially, early on in the summer, I think that when we looked at the polling data, even though I said polling doesn't sort of predict turnout, I mean, it does. Oftentimes we look at sort of enthusiasm amongst the electorate to figure out whether or not that's going to map into turnout. And during the summer, enthusiasm looked really low. So I think a lot of people thought it was going to be low turnout. When Biden stepped aside and Harris actually, took his place, there seemed to be a lot more enthusiasm on the Democratic side. So I think going into the night, everybody's best guess and this was amongst a lot of different people, is they thought that turnout might be a little shy of 2020, but that it was going to be potentially close. And we saw early voting looked strong. I mean, obviously, we did a lot of work at NBC and through Pores on tracking the early voting. But then when election night came up, we know how many people vote early because we were able to track that through our analysis of state voter files. And these voter files tell us who voted early. And so that turnout looked pretty robust. But what we saw was, again, not as much election day vote as we had expected. And a lot of people thought, a lot of Democrats thought that their electorate, which voted very heavily by mail and early in 2020, mainly by mail because of obviously the pandemic, they thought that their election day turnout was going to be more robust, and that turned out not to be true.
So as of this recording, NBC News has not projected control of the House. Can you talk about what's outstanding there and when you expect to be able to call control of the House?
Yes. So, I mean, one of the things, House races take a long time. And the reason why it takes a long time is there's states, especially states out west like California, that literally take weeks to count all of the vote. And there's a lot of competitive seats in the House. And so right now, we have a couple dozen seats that we still have not called. It is definitely looking like the Republicans will take control. This is Friday, but my guess is that we won't know until early next week. It could maybe go even a little bit further into the week. And there is an outside chance. I don't think it's a very good chance, but the Democrats have a little bit of opportunity still. So if they win all of the remaining sort of toss-up races and they sort of go together, there's a possibility that the Democrats could win 218 seats. I think it's unlikely, but still possible.
So one of the big stories that came out a week before election was Ann Seltzer's Iowa poll, which showed Harris up in Iowa by 3 points. Seltzer is a respected independent pollster who's been very accurate in the past presidential elections, predicting the winner in Iowa. She predicted Trump with a 7-point lead in 2016, and he won that state by nearly 9 points. So this year, it looks like Trump will win Iowa by 13 points. So what do you think may have happened there?
Well, I mean, I've always been a little skeptical of Seltzer's polls. I know that she's always been considered to be sort of the guru of Iowa, but she actually is very non-traditional in how she weights her polls. And so one of the things that most pollsters learned in 2016 that you need to weight by education, she does not do that. And so One of the reasons why I think she's been okay in the past is that Iowa is not a particularly diverse state. And so some of the things that we know we need to do in our polls that we need, she just, she hasn't done and it's turned out okay. But again, in polling, things can be fine, and then all of a sudden you can be thrown a real curveball. So, I think it was a combination of how she sort of approached her methodologically her poll, and also she made some strong assumptions herself about what the electorate would look like. And so this is another thing that pollsters have lots of decisions they have to make, and she made some pretty consequential decisions on who she thought would be, what the electorate would be. And she got it wrong. And when you get it wrong, she got it wrong. To her credit, I would say is that a lot of pollsters that I'd said earlier, they just wait to ties or wait to closer elections. She didn't do that. So I thought it was pretty gutsy of her to actually sort of go with, she didn't change her methodology. She stuck with it. She was honest and transparent, but she was badly wrong.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. It was very risky to go out that way and not follow in with the herding of the other pollsters and just sort of get in line with a tied result. And she did show some trends that we saw at least early on in the night, like white non-college women in some of the battleground states. Okay, so can you talk a little bit more about the art and science of polling? Obviously, polls are not meant to be predictive of the outcome, but can you talk about some of the pollster decisions and just thought processes that go into how they conduct a poll, weight a poll, analyze a poll, and then kind of what they put out for the American public?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. So, I think one of the things in the polling industry, I've been doing polling now for a while, and so at least a couple decades, and things have changed in the business. And so when I first started in my career, the pollsters actually reported out a lot more information. So they provided a lot of internal information on their poll. They give you things like response rates. That means, how many people did they have to try to contact and how many actually people took their polls. They also would be very explicit in their methodologies of how they weight the data. And so again, pollsters are making sort of decisions. And so, they're weighting by demographic variables. Now they've actually changed and actually usually they weight by some sort of partisanship variable, which means that they, might weight by the percentage of Democrats and Republicans and independents they think exist. And there's different ways to sort of do that. But what's I think that the thing that's a little bit problematic is that pollsters now, oftentimes when polls are put out, they don't provide you that information. So you can't know exactly what they're doing. You don't know what the response rates are. The response rates aren't good. Right? We know now that response rates are really, really, really low. But also, when you don't know what pollsters are doing, then you don't know, again, it's kind of a little bit of a black box. And so that makes it a little harder to actually figure out how to not only assess the polls, but also potentially fix them. Because, again, if you don't have that information, you're kind of guessing at what pollsters are doing. I think one of the big problems that pollsters face is that they really have strong incentives, reputationally and also even in some instances financially, because a lot of pollsters, what they sell are polls, to not get it wrong. And so those incentives can kind of and sometimes work against doing good polling, or at least it works against taking any sort of risks. So again, if pollsters see everybody else is having polls as being tied, maybe they're going to make a decision to weight their poll to be a tied. And we can't know what they're doing because they don't tell us. And then oftentimes when we ask them to share that information, again, 20 years ago, everybody shared it. Now, it's people keep that sort of in the lockbox. And sometimes people will share it if they're pushed, but not easily. And so the business needs to change. And the reason why it needs to be changed, now pollsters will say in this election that they didn't get it wrong that bad. So you're going to have a lot of people basically saying, well, we weren't that far off, but they were all off and they were systematically off. And so they got it wrong, even though they weren't that far off because they were very risk averse. They forced it to a tie. And so, and just with the nature of elections now, if you force it to a tie, even if you're really completely wrong in how you're doing it, it won't seem like you're that wrong. And so it will be interesting to see, in a lot of these postmortems, what pollsters have to say. I think I know what they're going to say. They're going to say, we didn't get it really wrong. But the truth of the matter is they did get it wrong.
So the exit poll team from NBC News published a story on Wednesday about the results, which talked about some interesting data points. But first, I would just want to make the point, too, for our listeners. John has mentioned this a couple of times, but the poor students on election night, we had, over 36 of them working with us on the exit poll desk with me. We had them working to get precinct data, as John mentioned earlier. And then we also had them collecting turnout information throughout the lead up into the fall for election night. They were helping gather all that data, contact election officials, doing all the legwork. So the exit poll results showed some interesting findings. One of them was that 45% of voters said they're worse off now than they were financially 4 years ago. And that number was the highest we've seen actually since 1992 when we started asking that question. And what struck, I think, a lot of people as we were looking at that was it was even higher than in 2008 during the recession. It was 43% then. We also talked to voters about what quality mattered most to them, and a large percentage said they wanted somebody who could bring about needed change, and Trump dominated among those Americans. One of the other things that we found was that the percent of voters who identified as Democrat this year was the lowest that we've seen this century, and the percent who identified as independent was the highest. Trump obviously made gains, among Latinos, as we talked about, and young people, and independents. So with all that in mind, John, is there anything else, any other points about the exit poll that you want to make, or anything that you think, a big story that was told or that could be told in the weeks, days afterwards?
Well, I think that you've hit on most of them, right? I think that our exit poll, one of the interesting things is the exit poll is a little bit unlike other polls in that we're actually talking to real voters. When you do a poll, you're calling up people and asking if they voted. You can actually, in some instances, cross-verify that to see, like with people who've said they voted early, you can actually check the voter file and see if that's true. But, again, I think the exit poll is particularly useful in getting that part of the electorate that is so critical, which is the election day voters. And that was really sort of what helped us understand better things. I think our exit poll did a particularly job in getting the Latino numbers right. And that's a huge story. And that's a story also. But I think one of the things, the lessons out of 2024 will be for Democrats is that they're going to need to rethink some things. And so they're going to need to rethink about, sort of how they're approaching Latinos. As you had said, Steph, a lot of Democrats were going into the election thinking it was going to be all about democracy. But one thing we've known consistently across the exit poll is usually the economy is the number one issue. And in 92, so you pointed that out, that was a big year where there was a lot of problems economically. That was, I think, the year that James Carville had it's the economy, stupid, and it ushered in Bill Clinton. And so, I'm sure that we're going to see a lot of James Carville on TV, saying, basically echoing what he said in 1992, but sort of in a way much more mournfully for Democrats.
And the economy actually was the most important issue on our exit poll from 2008, every presidential election year until now. And we were kind of surprised when we first saw the results come in. And the most important issue was actually the state of democracy. Now, there are some differences there by gender and age and things like that. But what was really interesting about the way this night, unfolded was that so many voters still feel, nationally on some of these big issues that Trump has been pushing, abortion and immigration, for instance, those percentages of people who support legal abortion and then who support undocumented immigrants being offered a chance at legal status, those numbers stayed consistent nationally. Not only did they stay consistent nationally, but Trump voters actually were more inclined to say that, yes, abortion should be legal and undocumented immigrants should be allowed to stay in this country. So I think it does also speak to the point of maybe just anger. There's a lot of pessimism, right? People were angry about the direction of the country more so than it does about the issues, quite frankly, in this election. So I think a lot of Democratic strategists and pundits look at the gains Democrats made in 2022 in the wake of the Dobbs decision and took this as an indicator that Harris might do better than Trump based on these midterm results. Why do you think these gains in the midterms didn't translate into success for Democrats, especially at the top of the ticket?
People hold the president extremely accountable, and people were still hurting. It's when you actually look on some of these issues, when you look at the economy. You had said it wasn't the number one issue, but it was very important for a lot of Republican voters. I think it was the number one voter.
Certainly was the number one issue among Trump voters.
And so, and some of those Trump voters were people who weren't Trump voters before. And so I think that it's from the lessons sort of learned is that, when there are certain core things that are extremely consequential for people when they turn out in presidential terms. And what we've seen is we've seen presidential elections that don't look like midterms, right? We saw 2020. One of the things we were I mean, all the polls suggested that Biden was going to win, but they suggested he was going to win it more easily. And then people were actually surprised that sort of Trump picked up sort of new voters. And so it's not like, sort of looking at it sort of retrospectively and seeing what we saw in 2020, seeing what we saw in 2016. It's not a huge surprise that Trump actually won. And I think actually what we'll see is like, my guess actually is that we go forward, if we were to look into the crystal ball going forward, when we look at some of these elections, my guess is that Democrats will regroup and actually do again well in some of these like sort of off-year elections. Like we'll have to obviously wait and see. But like when we look at, next year, when we look at like Virginia, I mean, everybody's going to look at that. But I think that this will, help Democrats in some ways mobilize. But again, there's a big difference between presidential election years and off years. And also, by the way, not just in like, how the results actually turn out, but even with polling, right? I mean, when we actually look back at sort of the track record of polling performed pretty well in 2018 and 2022 and did very poorly in 2016, 2020, and 2024. So there's just different dynamics in presidential years.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. So Trump excelled with low propensity voters again this year. And a lot of pollsters after 2016 changed their methodology in an effort to account for the voters who either weren't taking the poll who otherwise were not likely to vote. So do you think that there are now other ways that pollsters can improve there? What do you think the industry should do going forward?
Well, I think one of the things that the industry probably should do going forward is that they should be a little bit more transparent and a little bit more honest. And like I think that like the reason, like, going back to that piece that I wrote, I kind of tried to explain with my colleague Josh Clinton of like the decisions that pollsters are actually making. And so when I say being more honest, what people have to be honest about is that you make basically decisions or assumptions on how you weight your poll. They're hugely consequential. The decisions can move polls by as much as 8 points on the top line. That's a huge amount of difference, like, right? I mean, you're basically in some ways you're kind of picking who's going to be ahead. And so, as you know, Steph, my preference is that you actually sort of lay your cards out on the table. And like, I would actually weight polls multiple ways. I would actually show different electorates and basically say, if these assumptions are true, then this is what will happen, instead of like trying to point to one number, because the one number you can never know will be right. And if pollsters all are risk averse and they all decide that they want to herd on one number, they may herd on a number that almost certainly will be wrong, because what you'd rather be, you don't want to be too wrong, right? You might have incentives that you don't want to be too wrong. So maybe you push a race to be closer than it is. And so again, I actually think the polling industry is at a tipping point, and I think that there will be big changes for lots of different reasons. And so we will have to, hopefully, PORS will be at the center of that, not just the professors and staff that work at PORS, but will involve our students. I mean, one of the things that is so important to me, and it's one of the things that has made the Decision Desk at NBC so good, is that we, again, can bring in the students, give them an amazing experiential learning opportunity. Oftentimes they tell us when they graduate, it's their best moment at Penn. And it helps them because they learn so much. And it really helps us because they're big contributors, because we teach them in the classroom and we basically show them how that they can take what we've taught them and apply it in the real world. And there's nothing more real than work on the Decision Desk.
So as the director of PORS and a political science professor who teaches polling and data science, what are some areas of this work that you see as important for our PORS students to understand?
Well, I mean, I think that just what I had said is important is like you oftentimes teach students things in the classroom, but they don't know how to apply it. And so I think one of the things that we're doing very well in PORS and with our minor, we have a survey research and data analytics minor. There's also a data science and analytics minor that I'm director of. And I think that the thing that is very important is you need to teach students technical skills and you need to give them the sort of ability to do analysis, but you need to take it one step further. You actually then need to show them how to actually apply the tools that they've learned, because it's not intuitive always, like to actually figure out, okay, you've learned something in the classroom, but how would you apply it in the real world? And even though we're doing it, obviously in the context of elections with a lot of our work, we really try to show students how to generalize those skills and teach them how to think about problems and issues. And so when we do that, I think we equip our students to sort of go off into the world regardless of what they end up doing and sort of be successful.
These kind of experiential learning opportunities, especially this one on election night, also offer students the ability to know what it's like to work intensely under pressure. And I think that is something that is not that a student cannot otherwise get unless they're really working in the real world environment and in that moment. So now on the reverse side, what challenges do you think students face, and how are you encouraged by their experience in the program and at the Decision Desk overall?
Well, I mean, students face lots of challenges. I mean, I think that like one challenge that we've seen is that students had a, sort of depending upon where they were in their academic career, they had sort of very uneven experience during the pandemic. I think that COVID set students back. I think that they were isolated oftentimes, learning sort of online, and they were not working in groups. And one of the things that we do sort of at PORS is we teach students that, you've got to be a part of a team. And so there's like all the hard issues that sort of need to be solved and like sort of need to be that we're working on. Really no one individual can solve them. And so I think one of the things that the challenge for students is figuring out, again, how do you work in a team? How do you work collectively? How do you work collectively efficiently? And so I had said when, we teach them a lot of things in the classroom, but one of the things that we teach them in the experiential experience is not just to figure out how to think, but how do you actually interact well within a team, because they're going to be doing that for the rest of their lives. And so we want to kind of set give them some of the abilities to do that well so that they can, again, take that outside of Penn and apply it in the real world wherever they land.
So election night is over. The Decision Desk is obviously still working through the House races and the other, calls that are outstanding in some of the battleground states and things like that. What happens next for the Decision Desk, for the Penn students? After this settles, what is the next step for you? What's the goal and hope following this election?
Well, as you had said, we're not finished, so the students are still helping us. We're still trying to wrap this up. The reason why this is not a video cast is because no one wants to see me right now, what I look like.
Or me.
After working as many hours as we've actually worked. And so I definitely don't want anybody to see me. You can see me maybe in a month and I'll be fine again. But I think we had, in all seriousness, we had an extremely successful experience. We have scaled up the number of students that are working on the Decision Desk. We actually worked very hard to try to create opportunities because there's so much demand amongst our students. I've also worked with, I am working with the dean of the college, Peter Struck. He's a new dean, but I think he is an excellent dean. And one of his hallmarks is going to be that he wants to create more experiential learning opportunities for our college undergraduates. And so we're very aligned with what's going on in the college. And what I see is us creating more opportunities. And I think that really fits in with the mission and vision of what's coming out of College Hall.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John, for sitting down with me today.
Well, thank you, Steph. It was really a pleasure and a treat.
That's it for episode 5 and our post-election analysis. I hope you learned a bit about what goes on behind the scenes at the Decision Desk on election night. For our final episode, I'll talk with Roger Smith, Christopher H. Brown Distinguished Emeritus Professor of Political Science, about the implications of a second Trump presidency and what the future of democracy may look like in the United States. The Omnia podcast Democracy and Decision 2024 is a production of Penn Arts and Sciences in collaboration with the Penn Program on Opinion Research and Election Studies. Many thanks to today's guest, John Lapinski from the Department of Political Science. Be sure to subscribe to the Omnia podcast by Penn Arts and Sciences on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts to listen to every episode of Democracy and Decision 2024.